Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. 1.5 million refugees in a country with a pre-refugee influx of just 4.5 million people. That's how many Syrian refugees live in Lebanon. Today, we're joined by Markus Göransson, professor of war studies at the Swedish Defence University. Markus, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to get into your research in a second, and congratulations again on publishing a new paper. For this study, you were in Lebanon. You took two trips to Lebanon in 2017, and that was already 5 to 6 years into the start of the civil war, and since Syrians started fleeing into Lebanon. What was the situation like for the Syrian refugees living in Lebanon, and how has the situation evolved over the 5, 6 years?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me in this interview. So yes, I'm an assistant professor in war studies at the Swedish Defence University, and I did this research when I was a postdoc at the Stockholm School of Economics. And in 2017, when I spent a total of 6 weeks in Lebanon, I encountered a situation in these camps that was really quite heartbreaking, and I think it is difficult to exaggerate the misery that many Syrian refugees in Lebanon live in. Their situation is very, very bad indeed. The UN has conducted several studies on the living circumstances of Syrian refugees in Lebanon and has concluded that the vast majority of them live in poverty, and more than half of them, 58%, according to a study in 2017, live in extreme poverty. Most refugees are indebted. Joblessness is rampant. Indebtednent is rampant. Most children do not go to school, not because they're not allowed to, but because their parents cannot afford the kind of associated fees or expenses of sending children to school. The group of refugees that our study is based around are so-called informal tented settlers, which are refugees who live in kind of makeshift housing on the outskirts of cities or in the countryside, structures that resemble tent made of canvas or plastic. And apart from the very poor housing conditions, these people are often some of the poorest and most disadvantaged of refugees. And they live in areas of the country where you have relatively few employment opportunities. And they also face a situation of restricted movement. So it's difficult for various reasons, but I think we will get into later during this interview. It's very difficult for them to leave their settlements. And every time I kind of look or check back on how the situation has evolved in Lebanon, I become even more despondent, because it's a story of increasing deterioration, sort of slow, steady deterioration of the living circumstances of refugees, and it's been ongoing from the very beginning of the crisis. More people lose their jobs, more people are malnourished, fewer children go to school, etc. And this was reflected in the kind of the stories that I was able to, that people shared with me in Lebanon, and kind of a very widespread sense of hopelessness, and a lot of pessimism, and very little there's very little to see any light at the end of the tunnel for these people. And that was among the most depressing things of being there.
Kind of touched on this, but Lebanon was applauded by much of the international community, including UN agencies, for not building formal refugee camps. But does this mean that all Syrian refugees in Lebanon can move around freely?
No, it does not mean that by any means, really. It is true that Syrian refugees do not live in formal camps, unlike neighboring countries like Jordan and Turkey, where a proportion of Syrian refugees do live in formal camps. And Lebanon chose not to construct any formal camps for various reasons that can be linked to Lebanese history and Syrian Lebanese political concerns. So many of the Syrian refugees live in close to or even within Lebanese communities, whether that be cities and towns or villages, but they still face various restrictions on their free movement. So it is important to note that most Syrian refugees in Lebanon lack a residency permit and lack a work permit. And because they lack these permits, they kind of find themselves in a perpetual illegality. And they are always vulnerable to arrest by the security forces. The security forces always have grounds to arrest a Syrian refugee unless they belong to the very few who have legal permits to stay in the country. And in practice, this means that Syrian refugees, if they leave their camps, or if they leave the cities where they live, they may run into a checkpoint, a temporary checkpoint that's been established, or they may run into a police patrol or military patrol, and they will be asked for their papers. And if they cannot prove that they have the right to stay in the country, they are likely to be arrested and placed in detention for a while. So this is.
Sorry to cut you off, but if they currently have a valid permit, does that mean that at least within the city and area that they're in, that they can move in freely, or the entire country, or even if they have a valid permit, their movement is still restricted within the country?
No, so first of all, very few have valid permits. So that's a vanishingly small number of Lebanese refugees, or Syrian refugees in Lebanon. If they do have a permit, then they're free to move around the country, according to what I found in 2017. But most lack any such permit, and or lacked in 2017. I don't know the latest statistics on that. And they are vulnerable to arrest basically at any time. But in practice, it means when they leave their area of residence.
And so now I'd like to get into your research a little bit, which is about how Syrian refugees in Lebanon have used their mobile phones to strengthen their social network and also to find and maintain work. Can you please elaborate on both of these usages of mobile phones?
Right. So Lebanese, Syrian refugees in Lebanon have, even as most of their living circumstances have deteriorated over the past few years, they have been able to increase their social capital in Lebanon. It's kind of the one asset that they've been able to grow in Lebanon, according to certain studies. What that means is that they've been able to extend their social networks, their ties to other refugees, to Lebanese, medical specialists, taxi drivers, business owners, helpful neighbors, people who may be able to lend a helping hand in trying circumstances. And they have done this with the help of their mobile phones. And we found three ways in which the mobile phones have helped them in extending their social networks. One was that with the help of with their mobile phones, they were able to find family members, relatives, friends, other acquaintances from Syria who had also fled to Lebanon, since many Syrians did flee to Lebanon. So they're able to track down these people and reconnect with them. And in a surprisingly large number of cases, people then moved closer to individuals that they had been close to in Syria. So we came across cases of people who'd moved closer to relatives, first of all, but also to old neighbors or former colleagues, so that they could, provide kind of, they formed these clusters of mutual support. So that was one way. But then you also see refugees using their phones as kind of, makeshift social security nets. They, over time, they might exchange phone numbers to trusted people who could lend various forms of support, whether that be taxi drivers or aid workers or medical staff or other people. They might meet them in person and take their number, and they would save their number in their phone book, and then they could reach out to these people and when circumstances demanded it. It is important to keep in mind that because they live outside, they don't live in formal camps, and they become responsible for maintaining their own kind of social support networks. This is something that is maybe characteristic for the situation of refugees in Lebanon, that because of the way the Lebanese society is organized, and because of the kind of the myriad of different actors involved in the refugee response, then refugees need to kind of maintain their networks themselves, and the phone is an essential tool in maintaining these networks. And
sorry for cutting you off, but so there aren't any NGOs or other UN organizations that regularly visit them, if I'm understanding correctly?
No, they do. That's not quite what I meant, but they NGOs also are proactive, and UN agencies are proactive in finding refugees. But beyond that, refugees also need to maintain their own networks, and and it's not just with aid actors, but also with private hospitals or private businesses and so on.
And in your paper, you also touched on how they use their phones to find work and maintain work. What I was reading was slightly different than the social network that you were just talking about building. So can you just elaborate a little bit specifically regarding work and how they use to both get work and also maintain the job that they have?
So several refugees that I spoke to told me that they look for work with the help of their phones. I mean, some people would walk to businesses and visit them in person and ask if there were employment. But many people said that they would simply call them because it was unsafe to leave their camps. So they would stay in their homes and they would phone potential employers or employers that they knew from before and asked if they had an opportunity to work. So this was an important way of finding work. And then and people could do that people did that regularly. One person said that he would phone people on a regular basis to ask if there was any job available. And these job networks were quite extended. So we did part of our research in the north of Lebanon, and several of the people we spoke to told us that they were contacted by friends or acquaintances in Beirut, which is about 2 to 3 hours away, depending on the traffic, telling them that there was a job available for them in Beirut, so they would go to Beirut for work. So you can have these sort of job-seeking networks that span the country that were facilitated by the mobile phones. And then if you had a job or if you had a relationship to an employer, then you could keep in touch with the employer with the help of the phone, and the employer would tell you if there was work available for you on a given day, if you should come in to work. So you could have a running communication with the employer with the help of the phone.
And you touched on this during your previous response, but So you were saying that they also use their mobile phones to access, I don't know how to put it, extra aid, or when if something happens, some kind of emergencies, to get in touch with NGOs and UN agencies.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the phone was their link to the aid organizations, also the UNHCR. To get in touch with the UNHCR, you did that by phone. You phoned a number, or they would, if you were registered with them, they might send you a text message with information that concerned your case. So the phone was the link between the aid community and the refugee community. And the reason why the phone was so vital for the relationship, for the interaction between the aid organizations and the refugees, was that, again, this is a very sort of fluid or dynamic situation where refugees, first of all, they're spread across the country. They live in many different localities, often without addresses, often in informal housing. And many people move for work, for better housing, to get closer to their relatives. So, and this was even truer earlier during the crisis, that people moved a lot. So the only way for aid organizations to keep track of the people that they want to help is by phone, is by having a number that they can reach out to. And at the same time, you have a groundswell of, I mean, you have a myriad of aid actors in Lebanon. And they are coordinated, but they're not coordinated very strongly. And there's a lot of informal communication and coordination between aid organizations, and that's also done with the help of the phone and social networks. So you have that communication between aid actors to coordinate the response to refugees, so that you don't have a doubling of aid or duplication of aid and so on.
So, I mean, it really sounds like their mobile phones are crucial to every single aspect of their lives. But I was shocked to read in your paper that at bare minimum, it costs around 20 to 25 US dollars per household per month to maintain a mobile phone. I mean, that sounds terrifyingly expensive.
I think that's the average rate of expenditure for refugee households in Lebanon in 2017, according to UNHCR study. But yeah, that figure is staggering. Now, it's made even worse, I think, by the fact that in Lebanon, to keep your phone number, you need to spend monthly on that number. So in practice, what it means is that you subscribe to a number and you have to pay for that subscription every month. And when I was in Lebanon in 2017, the minimum amount that you needed to spend on your number was $9 US. That may have increased since then. I don't have the latest figures, but that was the minimum amount. And if you fail to spend that within, I think, 30 days, then shortly after that, your number expires and gets sold on to someone else. And then you lose your number, you lose your contacts, you lose your link to the UNHCR. So that forces the refugees, regardless of their financial situation, to prioritize spending on their phones.
And so you start your paper with the story of Abu Khodor, who fled Syria for Lebanon in 2013. Can you just quickly share his story with us?
Yeah, Abu Khodor is a very interesting example. That's not his real name. I anonymized all the respondents in my study. But yeah, so he fled from Syria and ended up in the city of Tripoli alone, living somehow found a flat in one of the more expensive parts of the city, and he found a job in construction. He was in his 50s and he had worked as a teacher prior. And now we find himself working as a construction worker and paying for a very expensive apartment. And he told me in the interview that he didn't know anyone. He was there, he was alone. He had no way of he didn't know how to access other opportunities. And then one day, he purchased a smartphone, and he created an account on Facebook, as many refugees who came to Lebanon did, to reach out to find their friends and relatives that had been cut off from. So he did that, and on Facebook he was able to reconnect with an old neighbor from his city in Syria, and they were chatting. They soon started chatting on WhatsApp, because WhatsApp is much cheaper to communicate on in Lebanon than via other platforms. And this neighbor told him, well, if your flat is so expensive and if your job is so difficult, why don't you move in with me here in northern Lebanon? The neighbor is also living in Lebanon. We have a cheap tent for you, and there's a job as a teacher in a local school for Syrian children. So Abu Khodo decided to take up his offer, and he soon moved to the north of the country. And when I interviewed him, he was still living in that tent. That was very affordable because it was a local benefactor who was sort of helping to keep the rent down. And he was working he wasn't working in that job anymore. He was working in a different job as a principal. But that was a job, another rung up the ladder, so to speak. And this was made possible by the phone. The phone helped him to kind of make use of his contacts to access different resources.
And finally, I know that this isn't part of your research and it started quite a while after your trips to Lebanon, but do you know at all how the coronavirus has been impacting Syrian refugees in Lebanon and how they're dealing with it? As you mentioned earlier on, most Syrian refugees don't have a valid permit, or a lot of them don't have a valid permit anymore. So I was reading stories that really means if you go out and seek help and to get tested, that could possibly lead to you being sent back to Syria. So do you know at all how they've been dealing and how coronavirus has impacted the Syrian refugee population in Lebanon?
I don't know the latest news about the corona situation among the refugees in Lebanon, unfortunately. But what I can say is that they are a very vulnerable population because of issues such as overcrowding, lack of access to medical care, pre-existing medical conditions. And I imagine that when I was there was a palpable fear of being in touch with the authorities. And I think these are issues that if they aren't being dealt with already by the Lebanese government, they need to be taken seriously, because I think that puts the Syrian refugee population in a special danger to be very hard hit by the pandemic.
Well, thank you very much, Markus, and sorry for putting you on the spot like that for that last question. And thank you everyone for joining us at the latest research news.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.